Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Maybe because she wasn't supposed to be there. Maybe because, in rooms like these, people like her were meant to be invisible, not questioned, not acknowledged, not seen. It was 6:30 a.m. at the Copper Ridge Veterans Center. The desert sun had barely touched the red brick walls, and the faint hum of an old coffee maker filled the silence of the common room. Irene Caldwell moved quietly between rows of chairs, wiping tabletops, refilling dispensers, straightening folded flags with hands that trembled just enough to suggest age or maybe memory. To most people, she was just the cleaning lady. The woman who mopped floors before the veterans arrived, who smiled too softly and spoke too little. But this morning, something different gleamed against the faded cotton of her polo shirt, a brass badge hanging from a thin chain. Small, worn, real. "Where'd you get that badge, Grandma?" The voice came from across the room, cutting through the morning calm like a blade through paper. Lieutenant Spencer Reed, young, confident and certain of his own authority, leaned against the doorframe, a smirk tugging at his lips. His uniform was perfect. Creased sleeves, shining boots, the kind of presentation that came from someone who'd never known the chaos of a battlefield, but thought he understood discipline because he'd mastered mirrors. The veterans in the room, men who'd seen Normandy, Saigon, and Baghdad, looked up from their coffee. They knew that tone. They'd heard it before, the tone of someone young enough to think experience could be measured by stripes and pins. Irene's hand instinctively moved to cover the badge. "It's mine," she said softly. Reed's grin widened, predatory. "Really? Because that looks like official military issue, and I don't recall any cleaning staff being issued one." He stepped closer. The room shifted, chairs creaked. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. From his table near the window, Leonard Shaw, 87, Normandy veteran, narrowed his faded blue eyes. He'd seen young officers like this before, sharp jawlines, sharper arrogance. He sipped his coffee but didn't speak. Not yet. Reed tilted his head, examining the badge. 118th MP Company, he read aloud. Never heard of it. Before Irene could answer, Sergeant Wade Bishop entered, phone already recording. He had that restless hunger, the kind that sees a viral video before it sees a human being. "Hey, this is gold," Bishop murmured, grinning. "Caught one of those fake veterans right here in the wild." "I'm not," Irene began, but her voice was swallowed by Reed's command tone. "Where did you get this, ma'am? Because wearing unauthorized insignia is a federal offense." "I told you," she said quietly, "it was issued to me." That stopped him for half a heartbeat, just enough time for the veterans to exchange glances. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was factual, controlled, like someone trained to report, not justify. Reed laughed, short and sharp. "Issued, lady, cleaning supplies are issued, MP badges are earned." Bishop's phone angled closer, the lens catching her lined face, the trembling hands. "Look at that," Bishop narrated for his viewers. "Classic stolen valor, old lady pretending she served. Unreal." "Turn that off," Cameron Wells muttered from the back. The youngest veteran in the room, late 20s, one prosthetic leg gleaming under the table's shadow. "Iraq, 2010. He knew humiliation when he saw it." But Bishop didn't stop. None of them did. Reed folded his arms. "Let me see your DD-214, ma'am. Every real veteran has their discharge papers." "I don't have them here." "Of course you don't," Bishop said, still recording, "because they don't exist." The badge caught a sliver of sunlight, its brass surface glowing faintly. The date etched beneath the insignia, October 3, 1993. Reed didn't notice, but someone else did. Cameron leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening, something tugging at the back of his memory. Reed's voice rose again. "You're mocking people who actually served, ma'am. This," he gestured toward the badge, "is disrespectful." "I did serve." The words came soft, steady, but the kind of steady that silences rooms. "Really?" Reed smirked. Then prove it, because I just searched and there is no record of a 118th Military Police Company. No active unit, no reserves, nothing. Irene didn't answer right away. Her eyes lowered to the floor, to the faint reflection of the badge's light dancing on the linoleum. "It was deactivated," she said. "A long time ago." Reed took a step closer. "You're lying." Her hand moved slightly, a subtle defensive instinct, and in that single motion the air changed. He reached forward, intending to snatch the chain, but her fingers caught his wrist mid-motion. The move was smooth, precise, efficient. And for a heartbeat, Reed couldn't move. Pain pulsed through his arm, not sharp but exact, controlled pressure on the right nerves. He recognized the technique instantly but couldn't place where he'd seen it executed with that level of precision. Then she released him. The trembling returned. She stepped back, eyes apologetic. "Reflex. You startled me." For a long second, no one spoke. Then Reed looked down at his wrist, red marks blooming against his skin. The veterans had seen it. They didn't need explanation. The old instincts flared, that muscle-deep recognition of a professional, someone who'd been trained long ago to act before fear could catch up. Reed's jaw tightened. "You're lucky I'm not pressing charges for assault." Irene said nothing. She picked up her cleaning rag and turned back toward the sink as if nothing had happened. But in that silence, something heavier moved, the kind of weight that only comes before revelation. Bishop whispered to his phone, "This one's going to blow up." And it did. Within an hour, the video hit 50,000 views. Comments piled up, outrage, mockery, hashtags like "copperage shame." By the time Irene stepped outside to tend the memorial garden, the internet had turned her into a villain. She knelt among the stones, pulling weeds from around the engraved names, her movements slow but deliberate. The Arizona sun washed her in gold, making the badge at her neck glimmer like fire. Inside, Reed stood by the window, watching her. "She's just a fraud," he muttered, "probably using some dead husband's memorabilia." "Sir," Private Mason Lee said hesitantly, "Mr. Shaw's asking for you." Leonard Shaw, stoic and silver-haired, waited by the window. "Lieutenant," he rasped, "you need to stop this." "With respect, sir, she's impersonating." "Don't patronize me, son." Shaw's voice cut through like gravel scraping steel. "I've seen liars. That woman's not one of them." Reed frowned. "You can't know that." "Oh, I can," the old man said. "Watch the way she moves. That's not arthritis making her hands shake, that's control. You're looking at a soldier who's spent her life pretending not to be one." Reed opened his mouth to respond, but Ernesto Garcia, Vietnam veteran, wheelchair-bound, hands trembling, rolled forward and lifted his sleeve. A faded tattoo revealed an old unit insignia. "You know this." "5th Special Forces Group," Reed answered automatically. "Good, then you understand when I tell you I recognize my own kind. And she's one of us." Before Reed could answer, the door burst open. A woman from town, frantic, holding her phone. "Is it true? That video? That old woman lying about being military?" The tension fractured. Within minutes, more people arrived, neighbors, reporters, angry locals hungry for confrontation. The quiet sanctuary for veterans became a storm of noise, camera flashes, and indignation. Reed tried to maintain order, but it was too late. The story had escaped him. The narrative was out of his hands now, rewritten by strangers who knew nothing of the truth. Through it all, Irene stayed in the garden, calm, silent, eyes scanning her surroundings with that same trained awareness Leonard had noticed. When Reed finally stepped outside, Bishop followed with his phone, still streaming. "Mrs. Caldwell," Reed said, voice hard, "I need you to surrender that badge. It's evidence." "No." The single word stopped him. It wasn't defiant, it was final. "Ma'am, that's not a request." "I understand." She brushed dirt from her hands, the tremor suddenly more violent. "But this badge is mine. I earned it. I won't hand it over to someone who doesn't understand what it represents." Then explain it, he said sharply. Tell me how you earned it. For a moment her face softened, grief passing behind her eyes like clouds over sun. She looked toward the horizon. October 3rd, 1993, she said quietly. Mogadishu. The word struck the air like thunder. Cameron froze mid-step. His lips parted slightly, whispering, Black Hawk down. Reed frowned. That was Delta Force, Rangers. There were no women in combat then. There weren't supposed to be, Irene said, but bullets don't check regulations. Bishop chuckled, forcing disbelief. Oh sure, you were there, part of some secret squad that doesn't exist. Yes. Her calm unnerved him. Before Reed could push further, a new voice spoke from behind them. Maybe I can help with that. Everyone turned. A man in his late 50s stepped into the sunlight's silver hair, posture straight, gaze sharp. Civilian clothes couldn't hide the military bearing that wrapped around him like armor. Who are you? Reed demanded. The man reached into his jacket, producing ID. Reed read the name and stiffened. Colonel Peter Vaughn, Fort Ironwood. The colonel's eyes locked on the badge around Irene's neck. His face paled, as if he'd seen a ghost. The 118th, he whispered. October 3rd, 1993. You know about it? Reed asked, confused. Vaughn didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly rolled up his sleeve. The room fell silent as a tattoo came into view, crossed pistols behind a shield. The same insignia, the same date. Around it were 5 words. 118th MP Company, Mogadishu. Never forgotten. Bishop lowered his phone. For the first time, he wasn't recording. He was listening. I know about it, Vaughn said softly, because I was there, and because 3 MPs saved 23 of us that night. 2 died, 1 lived. His eyes found Irene's, and I thought she didn't. No one moved. No one breathed. The veterans inside the building leaned toward the windows, the noise of the world fading until only the truth remained. The cleaning lady, the one no one saw, no one respected, had been the invisible thread holding history together. The brass badge at her throat caught the light once more. And in that glint, the line between truth and memory disappeared. What happens to a room when silence becomes heavier than noise? Nobody spoke, nobody even blinked. Only the hum of the air conditioner and the slow tick of the wall clock filled the space between Colonel Vaughn's words. I was there, he'd said, and the sentence still hung in the air like a suspended verdict. Lieutenant Reed stared at him, trying to fit the revelation into a world that suddenly felt off balance. His entire reality, his moral certainty, his crisp uniform, his sense of order, felt like it had been doused in kerosene and lit. Vaughn turned toward Irene. I didn't know you were alive, he said quietly. We thought the last of the 118th died that night. Irene didn't move. The tremor in her hands had stilled completely. I was supposed to, she murmured. It was easier that way. Reed swallowed hard. Colonel, with respect, this can't be right. The 118th isn't in any current database. There's no record, no. Of course there isn't, Vaughn interrupted. It was buried, deactivated, classified, sealed so deep you'd need presidential clearance to find a trace. He looked at Reed with tired eyes. You really think everything that happens in war ends up in the history books? Bishop shifted uneasily, his phone still in his hand but now lowered to his side. The live stream had stopped, though he hadn't realized it. He'd forgotten about the audience. For once, he was actually listening. Colonel Vaughn, Ruth Peterson said, stepping forward, her voice trembling. What is this? What's happening? Vaughn took a slow breath. What's happening, ma'am, is that you're about to understand why some people were never meant to be found. He turned back to Reed. You thought she was stealing valor. What she was actually doing was hiding from it. The words hit Reed like a punch. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend his actions, but Irene's voice cut through, soft but solid. Let him talk, Colonel. He deserves to know what he started. The colonel nodded. Mogadishu, October 3rd, 1993. You've heard the name Black Hawk Down. What you don't know is who was never mentioned. He looked back at Irene. 3 MPs, 3 women stationed on embassy security detail. They weren't supposed to be anywhere near the fight. But when the birds went down, when the convoys were pinned, they made a choice that changed the outcome of that night. Reed shook his head slowly. That's impossible. There were no female combatants listed in that operation. Exactly, Vaughn said. Because someone decided they shouldn't be. Politics, optics, regulations, take your pick, but reality doesn't always follow the paperwork. He rubbed his forearm where the tattoo glimmered faintly under the fluorescent light. We were trapped in the Olympic Hotel, 23 of us left. Outnumbered, low on ammo, bleeding out. Command had stopped trying to reach us. Then, just before dawn, 3 MPs rolled through hell in a Humvee and bought us 11 more hours of life. The colonel's voice cracked slightly. 2 of them died getting us out. The third, he looked at Irene again. She's standing in front of you. Reed felt the floor tilt beneath him. The shame rose fast, hot and choking. His voice barely worked. You're saying she was one of them. I'm saying she's the reason I'm still breathing. The veterans who'd been watching through the glass windows pressed closer. Cameron Wells' prosthetic leg whirred softly as he moved. Leonard Shaw gripped his walker, eyes wet. Ernesto Garcia whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Outside, the wind shifted, scattering the dust of the Arizona yard across the memorial plaques. Inside, Irene finally spoke. They told me to disappear, she said. Told me that if I wanted to live, I had to become nobody. So I did, and I kept that promise until this morning. Reed exhaled shakily. I didn't know. You weren't supposed to. Her gaze was steady but not cruel. You saw a cleaning lady wearing a badge she shouldn't own. You did what soldiers are trained to do, protect the integrity of the uniform. You just didn't ask yourself if your world was big enough to hold what you didn't understand. For a long moment, Reed couldn't answer. He felt like a man who'd built his identity on rules, only to discover that truth had never followed them. Then Vaughn's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening. Major Cole saw the video, he said. He's on his way here. Ruth looked alarmed. What video? Bishop raised his hand hesitantly. Mine. It, kinda went viral. Vaughn's eyes hardened. How viral? Couple 100,000 views, Bishop winced. Maybe more by now. Reed's stomach dropped. The colonel's next words were quiet but lethal. Lieutenant, you just broadcast classified history to the entire world. A heavy silence followed. Even the clock seemed ashamed to tick. What do we do? Mason Lee asked softly. Vaughn straightened, the officer in him returning. We contain what we can. Phones down, no more uploads. No one leaves this building. Bishop obeyed instantly. Ramirez locked the doors. Outside, curious locals still milled about, sensing scandal but not understanding the danger. Then Ruth said, almost whispering, if this was supposed to stay secret, what happens now? Vaughn's reply was grim. Now the people who buried it come looking for what's still alive. An hour later, Major Timothy Cole's staff car screeched into the lot. 2 military police stepped out first, scanning the perimeter. Cole followed, mid-40s trim, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. He entered the building without a word. His presence filled the space like gravity. Colonel Vaughn, he said flatly, you mind explaining why half the internet is discussing an MP unit that doesn't officially exist? Vaughn gestured toward Reed. Ask him. Reed stood rigid, every muscle locked. Sir, I believed I was exposing a case of stolen valor. Believed, Cole snapped. Believed is what you say when you've already ruined something. He looked toward Irene. Mrs. Caldwell, if that's even your name, do you realize what kind of storm this has created? Irene met his gaze calmly. I've lived through worse storms, Major. Cole studied her for a beat, then turned back to Vaughn. Is it true? Vaughn nodded slowly. All of it. Cole exhaled, rubbing his temples. God help us. He turned to Reed again. You may have just compromised national security and reignited a 30-year-old cover-up that was buried for a reason. Reed's throat tightened. Sir, if what she says is true. It is true, Vaughn cut in. I saw it. I bled there. The least we owe her is the dignity of believing the blood we spilled together meant something. Cole looked from Vaughn to Irene to the silent veterans in the corner, all watching, all listening. The weight of it pressed down like desert heat. Then we move fast, Cole said finally. We scrub everything online, coordinate with intelligence. Until I say otherwise, this building is on lockdown. Outside, daylight was beginning to fade. The news vans had arrived. Reporters crowded the gates, cameras rolling, shouting questions. Who is Irene Caldwell? Why is the military here? Inside, tension grew thick enough to taste. Cameron Wells stood beside Irene, voice low. They're not going to let this go, are they? No, she said, not this time. Reed approached slowly. He looked older than he had that morning. Ma'am, the word felt heavier now. I'm sorry. She turned to him, studying his face, seeing the remorse there. Regret's easy, she said gently. Redemption takes work. He nodded once, then tell me what to do. Before she could answer, a voice called from the hallway. Major, you need to see this. An MP hurried in with a tablet. On the screen was a news feed, live footage from the Copper Ridge parking lot. At the gate stood a man in a gray suit flashing credentials. The caption at the bottom of the broadcast read, Department of Defense, Inspector General's Office. Cole frowned. That was fast. Vaughn's jaw tightened. Too fast. He motioned to Reed, with me. When they stepped outside, the man was waiting, calm, polite, utterly unremarkable. His eyes, though, carried that predatory stillness that soldiers recognize instantly. Gentlemen, the man said smoothly, I'm here for Major Caldwell. Reed blinked. Major. Vaughn didn't answer. Neither did Irene, who had followed them out quietly. You're late, she said to the man. I figured you show up sooner. He smiled thinly. We move at the speed of necessity. He opened a briefcase, producing a single sheet of paper. Official offer of protection. New identity, relocation, full anonymity. All contingent on one thing. Silence, Irene said. Exactly. Reed's pulse quickened. Are you threatening her? The man's smile didn't change. Lieutenant, I'm offering her life. Irene's laugh was small, tired. You had 32 years to offer me life. You chose silence instead. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a simple flash drive. This contains everything you wanted erased. The man's composure slipped. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? Her voice hardened. I kept my promise once. I won't keep it again. Vaughn stepped closer, placing himself slightly in front of her. You need to leave, Agent. This isn't over, the man said quietly. No, Irene replied. It's just beginning. He hesitated a moment longer, then turned and walked away, vanishing into the growing dusk. Vaughn exhaled slowly. That was DIA, he muttered. They don't make offers like that unless someone up the chain is terrified. Reed stared at Irene. What's on that drive? The truth, she said. Names, dates, proof of what really happened in Mogadishu and who made sure it disappeared. Vaughn's gaze met hers. You still have it after all this time. I've had it on me every day since 1993. She slipped the drive back into her pocket. And if I die, it goes everywhere. Cole appeared in the doorway, having watched the exchange. You realize what you've just done, Mrs. Caldwell. You've declared war on ghosts that still wear uniforms. Irene looked at him, her eyes tired but clear. Then let them come. I'm done hiding. That night the Veterans Center transformed. The news vans outside kept their lights burning, painting the building in white glare. Inside, soldiers moved with quiet purpose, securing entrances, setting up communications, turning a community center into a fortress. Reed stood watch by a window, his reflection caught between fluorescent light and darkness beyond. Behind him, Irene sat alone at a table, the badge resting against her chest. She turned it over once in her hand, thumb tracing the etched date. "I shouldn't have worn it today," she said softly. Reed turned. "Then why did you?" Her eyes lifted to his. "Because some memories need air or they rot inside you." He nodded slowly. "What happens now?" She looked toward the window, where the flashing camera lights pulsed like distant gunfire. "Now," she said, "now the past stops whispering and starts to speak." Outside, the desert wind carried the faint echo of sirens approaching from the highway. Inside, the badge gleamed once more under the harsh white light, a small piece of metal heavy with 32 years of silence finally beginning to break. What does silence sound like when it isn't peace? It was the kind that vibrated through concrete, the kind born from tension, not calm. The Copper Ridge Veterans Center, usually a place of soft conversation and slow breathing, had turned into something else entirely. At every door, soldiers stood watch. Radios murmured. The old linoleum halls, once scuffed by wheelchairs and walking canes, echoed with the weight of boots. Outside, camera lights flashed like lightning. Inside, the people who'd once gathered to remember war were preparing to live through one again. Irene Caldwell sat in the center of it all, a cleaning rag still in her lap, the brass badge catching the glow of a flickering fluorescent bulb. Her hands trembled again, but not from weakness this time. It was adrenaline, memory. Lieutenant Reed watched from a few paces away, guilt hanging on him like armor too heavy to remove. He'd been trained to debrief, to analyze, to fix, but not this. Not the unraveling of a life hidden for 3 decades. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. Colonel Vaughn stood near the entrance, barking quiet orders into a radio. Major Cole paced the corridor outside Ruth Peterson's office, voice clipped and cold. And the veterans, men who'd come here to play cards and trade stories, sat quietly in a half circle, eyes sharp, backs straight. They weren't reminiscing anymore. They were witnesses now. Finally, Irene broke the silence. 32 years is a long time to stay quiet, she said softly. Maybe too long. Reed turned toward her, then start talking. Her eyes met his, steady, searching. You really want to know what happened in Mogadishu? I think we all need to. She nodded once. All right, but you need to understand something first. Heroes don't walk away clean. What we did that night wasn't glorious. It was desperate, and the price never stopped collecting interest. The tremor stopped again as she began to speak. The battle started at 15:30 hours. We heard it over the radio, 2 birds down, Rangers pinned in the Bakara market. We were 3 miles away, stationed at the embassy compound, the 118th Military Police Company. Officially, our job was training Somali police, managing local security. Unofficially, we were glorified bodyguards for politicians who didn't understand the war they'd stepped into. Her voice changed slightly, lower, steadier, as if the story lived in muscle memory. I was Staff Sergeant Caldwell then. Maria Santos and Rebecca Hayes were with me. We weren't combat troops. At least, that's what our paperwork said. But the Army has a way of training you for what it doesn't want to admit you'll do. She looked down at her hands. When the first radio calls came in, we heard the panic. Command couldn't reach half their units. Convoys trapped, streets blocked, helicopters burning in alleys. We listened to men die through static. She paused. You ever hear someone die over a radio, Lieutenant? Reed shook his head. It's not like in movies, she said. There's no scream, just breath, then nothing. You can tell the second the line goes dead. Vaughn had stopped packing, his jaw tightened. He'd heard it before, too. Maria found me in the comms room. She said 7 words that still haunt me. Irene's voice softened. We can't let them die alone. The words landed like a gunshot. So we made a decision, she continued. Disobey orders. Leave the compound. Go where we weren't supposed to. 3 MPs, no backup, no authorization. 1 Humvee, 3 rifles, and a map that might as well have been drawn by ghosts. You knew the odds, Reed asked. Better than anyone. But we also knew what it felt like to listen to men beg for help no one was sending. The veterans around her nodded quietly. Some wiped their eyes. Rebecca was the driver, Irene said. Maria rode shotgun. I was on the .50 Cal. We left at 1900 hours just before sunset. The city was already on fire. We followed side roads, places the convoys couldn't fit. Narrow alleys full of civilians who looked at us like we were aliens. Then the first checkpoint appeared. They had technicals, trucks with mounted guns. We should have been shredded in seconds. Her voice thinned, trembling but controlled. But Rebecca drove like a ghost, hit a pile of debris, used it like a ramp. We flew over their barricade before they even adjusted aim. Maria was shouting coordinates, feeding me targets. We made it through somehow, but I'll never forget the sound of the rounds hitting that armor. Each one felt like a heartbeat. Cole's expression had softened. His officer's posture gave way to something more human, something that remembered fear. They called it suicide, Irene said. Maybe it was, but sometimes dying with purpose feels like the only way to live with yourself. She went quiet again, the memory dragging her back. When we reached the Olympic Hotel, it looked like hell. Smoke, blood, broken glass. Rangers holding positions with what little ammo they had left. And Colonel Vaughn, bleeding through his uniform, still giving orders. Vaughn exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the floor. I remember the noise before I remember the faces, then your voice on the radio. Package delivered, Irene said faintly, smiling through the pain. Maria's words, not mine. She saved 8 of my men, Vaughn said quietly, and paid for it with her life. Everyone in the room listened without moving. The fluorescent light above flickered once, like a breath. Maria took the wounded back toward the compound, Irene continued. We knew she wouldn't make it, but she went anyway. Said somebody had to get them home. That left Rebecca and me with 15 Rangers and no extraction. We fortified the hotel. 2 floors, north and south corridors, limited ammo, full moon. You could see their silhouettes moving across the rooftops like shadows that hated light. Her eyes glazed for a moment. Rebecca held the north corridor for 9 hours. She was the best shot I've ever seen. Every approach she broke them, until they came from all sides. Vaughn swallowed hard. We heard the explosion. She was still breathing when I reached her, Irene whispered. 17 rounds. Still giving me tactical updates, still apologizing that she couldn't hold. She died before I could lie and tell her she'd done enough. The room had gone still. Ruth Peterson covered her mouth. Reed blinked rapidly, trying to imagine it but failing, because you couldn't imagine that kind of devotion until you'd seen it. I stayed, Irene said finally, because if I left, her death meant nothing. My knee took a hit from shrapnel an hour later. I couldn't stand, but I could still shoot, so I did. Reed's throat tightened. For how long? Until dawn, Vaughn answered for her. 2 hours alone. She bought us time to evacuate the wounded. Irene nodded faintly. When they tried to lift me first, I told them I'd shoot anyone who touched me before every Ranger was out. That's the part they didn't write in the reports. Cole's voice was soft now. They didn't write any of it, did they? No, Irene said, because women weren't supposed to bleed in combat, because the army needed clean lines, not complicated truths. She leaned back, exhaustion catching up to her. After we came home, they gave us medals in a room with no windows, classified citations, no press, no photos. They told us we'd made history, but history didn't have room for us. Vaughn's face was grim. The official record lists 0 female combatants in the Battle of Mogadishu. Exactly, Irene said, and maybe I could have lived with that, but then we found something we weren't supposed to. Reed frowned. Found what? The real reason that hotel mattered. She took a deep breath. Inside, behind the walls, were crates of American weapons. M16s, ammunition, Stinger missiles, gear that was supposed to have been destroyed after the Gulf War, except someone had been selling it, to the very people we were fighting. Reed's stomach twisted. You're saying? I'm saying American soldiers died in 1993 because someone back home was making money off their deaths. The words fell heavy and final. Maria documented everything, Irene went on. Serial numbers, manifests, photographs. Rebecca hid the copies. We gave them to command after we got home, and a week later the Army buried the entire operation. They classified it, Vaughn said bitterly. Said it was about political stability, but the truth was simpler: corruption. Someone high enough to erase the paper trail. Cole's face hardened. How high? High enough that 32 years later the wrong people still remember my name, Irene said. That's why I disappeared. Changed jobs, changed states, changed lives, and every time the past tried to catch up, I moved again. Reed stared at her, the enormity of it settling in. He'd accused this woman of stealing valor, and she'd been living with the burden of having too much of it. What about the others? He asked quietly. Dead, she said simply. Maria's accident was the start. Rebecca's car crash came 3 months later. I was supposed to be in that vehicle. Switched shifts because of a doctor's appointment. After that, I stopped trusting coincidence. She touched the badge gently. This was the only piece I kept. A reminder, not of what we did, but of what we lost. Cole rubbed his temples again. So the evidence, those photos, manifests, you still have them? I have 1 copy, she said. The rest are locked away, insurance policy. If anything happens to me, they surface automatically. Dead man switch, Vaughn murmured. Exactly. Reed looked at her in awe. You've been living like that for 3 decades. She smiled faintly. You learned to live quietly, to clean floors instead of clearing rooms, to blend in until no one looks twice. The tremor returned. But invisibility costs something. Every day, you fade a little more until one morning someone accuses you of being what you never stopped being, and maybe part of you feels relieved. Her voice broke slightly, because at least they're looking at you again. The room was silent, the kind of silence that acknowledges guilt. Vaughn placed a hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing. Maybe, she said, but right things don't always feel right. Reed stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper. What do you want us to do? Irene's gaze rose slowly. Help me finish it. If the truth comes out now, maybe the ghosts stop following me. Cole exhaled. If we go public, they'll come for you. They already have, she said. You saw him, the DIA man. They won't stop until either I'm gone or the truth is. Then we protect you, Vaughn said. All of us. Reed nodded immediately. Whatever it takes. The veterans around the room, Leonard, Ernesto, Cameron, nodded too. Old soldiers volunteering for one last fight, this time not with rifles but with truth. Irene looked at each of them in turn, her expression softening. You all understand what you're signing up for. Leonard grinned weakly. Lady, I survived Normandy. If they want a rematch, they can come find me. A ripple of laughter broke the tension for a heartbeat. Even Irene smiled. But then she said quietly, this isn't just about me. It's about what kind of soldiers we become when we stop questioning the stories we're told. Her gaze drifted to Reed. You thought you were defending honor. Instead, you reminded me that silence isn't dignity, it's surrender. The words stung, but he nodded. Then let's make it right. Outside, the desert wind began to rise, carrying dust through the floodlights and over the news crews. Inside, the lights flickered again. The badge at Irene's neck caught the glow, gleaming like a beacon for a past refusing to stay buried. She leaned back against the chair, eyes half closed. "Tomorrow," she whispered, mostly to herself, "tomorrow we stop hiding." Vaughn glanced toward Cole. "Then we'd better be ready." Because somewhere beyond those desert hills, phones were ringing in places that didn't appear on maps. People who'd built their power on silence were learning that the quiet woman they thought was gone had finally decided to speak. And this time, the world was listening. Dawn came without warning. Not as light, but as confession. The Copper Ridge Veterans Center was still locked down when the first sliver of sun crawled over the desert horizon. It painted the red hills gold, then bled through the dusty windows until every shadow inside seemed to shrink. No one had slept. Colonel Vaughn had spent the night on the phone with command, trying to convince invisible voices that the woman in his custody wasn't a threat. Major Cole paced between the lobby and the office, replaying the last few hours in his mind like a bad briefing tape that refused to end. Lieutenant Reed stood by the front window, one hand on the curtain, watching the news vans multiply outside the gate. Their satellite dishes pointed upward like weapons searching for a signal. And in the middle of it all sat Irene Caldwell, a woman who'd stopped running. She hadn't moved since sunrise. The badge still hung against her chest, glinting faintly each time the light shifted. On the table beside her lay a single envelope, sealed, unmarked, waiting. Cameron Wells poured her coffee. He hadn't said a word since midnight, but every move he made spoke of quiet allegiance. He placed the mug in front of her and whispered, "You sure about this?" Her fingers curled around the cup, absorbing the warmth. "No," she said, "but I'm tired of being sure about nothing." Vaughn approached, voice rough with fatigue. "The DIA won't back off. They've sent another team. This time they won't come asking politely." "I know. They'll come heavy, Irene. You still have time to take the relocation deal." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "If I disappear again, it's just another silence. That's all they ever wanted." The colonel didn't argue. He knew better. The hardest soldiers to protect were the ones who'd already made peace with their ghosts. Major Cole entered, holding a tablet. His face had lost the authority of command, now it carried something more personal. The story, everywhere, every outlet. Some calling you a hero, others calling you a liar. We've got conspiracy theorists saying the 118th never existed, that you're a psyop plant. And worse. He hesitated. "Say it," Irene said. "They dug up your old records, birthplace, marriages, addresses. You've been exposed completely. You don't have a past to hide behind anymore." Irene sipped the coffee, her hands steady now. "Then it's about time they meet the woman who lived it." Cole sighed. "This isn't bravery anymore, it's a death sentence." "Maybe," she said softly, "but at least it'll be mine." By mid-morning, 2 Humvees rolled up to the perimeter fence. Dust spiraled behind them. Soldiers stepped out, a mix of uniforms and plain clothes. Their commander, Captain Riley Chen, walked forward, sharp-eyed, calm. Vaughn met him halfway. "You here to protect her or take her?" "Both," Chen said simply. "Orders are to ensure her safety while arranging immediate transport to Fort Ironwood." "Whose orders?" Chen hesitated, then answered, "The secretary." Vaughn frowned. "That's too high up, too fast." "Maybe not fast enough," Chen replied. "The chatter overnight was bad. Someone doesn't want this story breathing through another sunrise." From the lobby window, Irene watched the exchange. Reed stood beside her. "You trust them?" She shook her head slowly. "I trust intentions, never orders." He turned toward her. "If you don't go with them, they'll come by force. Then I guess we find out what kind of soldiers they really are." By 10 a.m., the center looked like a checkpoint. Cameras outside, rifles inside, and tension everywhere. The veterans sat together quietly. Shaw's cane leaned against his knee. Ernesto's wheelchair hummed faintly as he shifted closer to the table where Irene sat. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you want us to do something, you just say the word." She smiled faintly. "You already did, you listened." But her eyes stayed fixed on the window. Outside, a black SUV had joined the convoy. It wasn't military. Cole saw it too, his gut clenched. "Private security," he muttered. "That's not good." Vaughn walked toward Irene. "You've got company." She stood slow and deliberate, every joint stiff but unbent. "Let them in." Cole's jaw tightened. "They're not cleared." "They're coming either way," she said. "Better to face the storm while you're still standing." Moments later, the door opened and a man stepped inside, late 40s. Immaculate suit, calm as ice. The same one from the night before. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted, voice smooth. "Or should I say Major?" Vaughn stepped between them. "You weren't invited." The man smiled. "You can't invite a storm, Colonel. You can only prepare for it." Irene rose from her chair, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You had your chance. You could have protected the truth 30 years ago. You didn't." He nodded slowly. "Because some truths are heavier than bullets. And some silences kill more people than wars." For the first time, his composure faltered. He gestured to two men behind him. "We're done negotiating." Reed's hand went to his holster, but Vaughn's low voice stopped him. "Stand down, Lieutenant. Let her speak." The agent leaned forward, his voice soft but venomous. "You're endangering national security, Mrs. Caldwell. The files you hold could destabilize entire alliances." "Or they could finally make them honest," she replied. He exhaled, a humorless sigh. "You always did think the world could handle the truth. It can't. Then maybe it deserves to fall apart." He glanced around the room, the soldiers, the veterans, the witnesses, and realized something had shifted. He no longer controlled the silence. He straightened his tie. "This is your final warning." Vaughn stepped forward, unarmed but unyielding. "You're not taking her anywhere." The man looked at him, one soldier measuring another. Then he said quietly, "You don't understand, Colonel. You're standing between the past and the people who need it buried." Vaughn didn't blink. "Then they can dig through me first." The agent hesitated, then nodded to his men. "We're leaving for now." He turned back to Irene. "But remember, exposure cuts both ways. Heroes can be destroyed as easily as villains." As the door closed behind them, the room stayed silent for a long time. Then Reed said, "They're bluffing." "No," Irene said, "they're warning." Cole rubbed his temples. "They'll spin this any way they want. They'll leak documents, fabricate records, discredit you before lunchtime." "That's why we move first," Irene said. "Move where?" "To the source." She tapped the envelope on the table. "Coordinates. The last place the 118th existed. A hangar outside Mogadishu. The proof's still there, or what's left of it." Reed frowned. "You kept that all these years." "I couldn't go back then," she said. "But maybe now I can send someone who will." "Send?" Vaughn asked. "You're not going yourself." She hesitated. "I'm old, Colonel. I wouldn't survive a flight like that." Reed shook his head. "Then I'll go." The words hung between them. Everyone turned. Vaughn looked at him carefully. "You don't even know what you're walking into." "Doesn't matter," Reed said. "I started this. I owe it." Irene studied him for a long time, then nodded. "You have a soldier's face now. Not the kind they polish for ceremonies, the kind that's been cracked open and rebuilt." She handed him the envelope. "Whatever's inside, you don't open it until you're there. Understand?" He nodded once. "Take Cameron with you," she added. "He knows what it's like to lose something you can't explain. You'll need that kind of strength." Cameron blinked in surprise. "Me?" "You still remember what it's like to fight for someone who can't," she said. "That's what this needs." Cole stepped forward, lowering his voice. "If they find out you're sending people overseas on your own initiative, they'll brand you rogue. They'll call it treason. Maybe truth needs a traitor, Irene said. The words chilled everyone. By early afternoon, the center's air buzzed with motion. Plans whispered, coordinates copied, cover stories rehearsed. Vaughn contacted old allies, retired intelligence officers who owed him more than money. Cole called in favors for a plane that didn't exist on paper. Outside, the press shouted questions no one answered. And through it all, Irene moved quietly through the halls, pausing at every photo on the wall, men and women in uniform, captured in moments of pride. She touched each frame lightly, as though giving benediction. When she reached the last picture, the memorial plaque for fallen MPs, she stopped. There at the bottom, two names, SGT, Maria Santos, and CPL, Rebecca Hayes. She traced the engraving with her fingertip. "We're almost there," she whispered. Ruth Peterson approached from behind, hesitant. "You okay?" Irene smiled faintly. "No, but that's how I know I'm still alive." Ruth nodded, tears shining. "I'll pray for you." "Don't," Irene said softly. "Pray for the truth instead." Evening came fast. The desert turned gold again, then bled into rust. Two figures, Reed and Cameron, stood beside a nondescript van in the parking lot. Vaughn handed them a sealed case. "Everything you'll need. Satellite comms, local contacts, false IDs." Reed opened the van door, heart pounding. "And if we don't come back?" Vaughn's expression softened. "Then I'll tell them you went looking for what the world forgot." Cameron climbed in beside him. "Guess we're not done serving yet." From the steps of the center, Irene watched them. The wind caught her hair, lifting a few silver strands into the sunset. She raised her hand slightly, a farewell or maybe a blessing. Then the van pulled away, kicking up a cloud of desert dust that glowed in the fading light. Vaughn stood beside her. "You trust him?" She smiled faintly. "He used to believe in mirrors. Now he believes in shadows. That's progress." He nodded. "And when they come for you again?" "They won't have to look far," she said. "I'll be right here." The colonel watched her for a moment, seeing not the cleaning woman he'd met yesterday, but the soldier he'd bled beside 32 years ago. The silence between them felt sacred. Finally, Irene turned and walked back inside. The halls were dim, quiet. The badge at her chest caught the last sliver of sun through the window. For a moment it gleamed like fire, then the light faded. Outside, the horizon swallowed the van heading east, toward secrets buried in foreign sand. And inside, a woman who'd carried the weight of silence for 3 decades sat alone, waiting for the truth she'd finally unleashed to find its way home. Because sometimes the bravest act isn't fighting the war you remember. It's surviving long enough to face the one that comes after. Some places never stop burning. Even when the smoke's gone, the heat stays buried in the ground, waiting. Mogadishu was like that. When the plane dipped beneath the clouds, Reed saw the city stretch out like an old scar, jagged, rebuilt, and still raw. The streets were alive again, yes, but something about the air felt watchful. Every window, every alley, every shadow seemed to remember. Cameron leaned toward the window, his prosthetic leg tapping softly against the floor. "Doesn't look like a place that forgot her," he said quietly. Reed didn't answer. His eyes tracked the coastline, endless sand meeting endless water. He'd never been here before, yet it felt like he'd stepped into someone else's memory. When they landed, the heat hit like a wall, the kind that tasted of salt and dust. A contact from Vaughn's network met them at the gate, a man in his 60s, sharp-eyed despite the years. "Name, Idris," he said, extending a weathered hand. "I drove the convoys back in '93. If she sent you, you're already in trouble." Reed smirked faintly. "That makes 3 of us." Idris led them through narrow streets lined with vendors and rusted vehicles. Kids ran barefoot past walls painted with colors that time had almost erased. The chaos was alive, loud, human, but somewhere beneath it all, Reed could feel a hum, a pulse of something buried and breathing. They reached a small compound near the outskirts, low walls, a single guard, and a roof that looked ready to collapse. Inside, maps and old photos hung on the walls. Idris pointed to one of them, a grainy shot of 3 soldiers beside a Humvee. 2 women, 1 man, faded smiles under desert sun. Reed froze. That's her. Irene, younger, sharper, alive in a way that the quiet woman at Copper Ridge had hidden. Her eyes in the picture carried that strange calm of someone already acquainted with danger. Idris nodded. You see her badge? Reed leaned closer, the same brass glint. Yeah. She never took it off. Not then, not now. Cameron's voice was low. What about the others? Idris's gaze dimmed. Dead, but their ghosts stayed. He unfolded a map. The hangar you're looking for still standing. Used to be under UN control, then abandoned. Locals call it the Silent House. Nothing grows near it. Animals avoid it. Even the wind forgets how to blow there. Reed frowned. Why? Idris looked at him carefully. Because the ground remembers blood. They left at dusk. The truck rattled over broken roads, headlights cutting through clouds of red dust. As the city fell behind, the air grew quieter. Cameron loaded his rifle without a word. You think she was right? He asked. About what? The proof still being here. Reed gripped the steering wheel. If it isn't, someone made sure of it. Then why risk coming back? Reed's voice softened. Because some debts don't expire. They drove another 20 miles before the hangar appeared. A massive steel carcass half buried in sand, windows shattered, doors rusted open like broken jaws. They parked 100 yards out. The silence was wrong. No birds, no wind, only the faint hum of their own breath through the dust masks. Cameron raised his night vision goggles. Nothing moving. Then we move. They entered through a side door barely hanging by its hinges. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of oil and time. Rows of empty crates stretched across the hangar floor. Stenciled on their sides were faint letters, property of U.S. government. Most were empty. A few were sealed. Reed knelt beside one, brushing away sand. The serial numbers matched those Irene had mentioned. She wasn't lying, he whispered. Cameron pried open another crate with his knife. Inside, under a rotting tarp, were metal tubes, missiles, American-made. Holy hell, he muttered, these are stingers. Reed's stomach sank. 30 years old and still enough to start a war. Cameron straightened. If we get this on record. A sound cut him off. Footsteps slow, deliberate. Reed signaled for silence. They crouched behind the crates as flashlights swept across the far wall. Voices not English. Somali mixed with another accent. Russian, maybe. Cameron mouthed, they're not locals. Reed's heart hammered. Someone else knew the hangar's secret, and they just walked into the same graveyard. He glanced at the far corner, an old office with a half-collapsed door. He motioned for Cameron to move. They slipped inside quietly, closing it just enough to watch through the gap. 2 men entered the hangar fully armed. One carried a satellite phone. The other wore tactical gear with no insignia. The taller man spoke in English now. Get the photos. We burn this place tonight. Reed's breath caught. Photos. He scanned the office, filing cabinets rusted shut, papers turned to dust. But near the back, beneath a fallen beam, something glinted. A small metal box. Cameron crawled toward it, careful not to make a sound. He pulled it free, wiping off sand. You think this is it? Open it. Inside were film canisters, a handful of photographs, and a folded document wrapped in plastic. Reed unfolded it slowly, a typed inventory list. Every serial number matched the crates outside. This is it, he whispered. It's the proof. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone was coming toward the office. Cameron drew his sidearm. Reed grabbed the box. We move now. They slipped through a back opening, climbing over debris. The footsteps followed. Voices shouted. Gunfire cracked, sharp, echoing. They sprinted toward the truck, sand kicking up behind them. Bullets struck metal, ricocheting off the rusted hangar walls. Cameron fired a burst over his shoulder. "Keep moving." Reed dove behind the driver's door, slamming the key into the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. As the truck tore down the dirt road, Cameron reloaded. "You think they saw our faces?" "Doesn't matter," Reed said. "They'll be coming either way." He looked in the mirror. The hangar was now a fireball, flames devouring everything they'd left behind. Cameron muttered, "So much for evidence." Reed lifted the metal box, not all of it. Half a world away, Irene sat alone in the Copper Ridge common room. The TV glowed with breaking news, unconfirmed reports of explosions outside Mogadishu. She didn't need confirmation. She could feel it, the way soldiers sometimes feel rain before clouds appear. Vaughn entered quietly. "You heard." She nodded. "They found it." He studied her, and someone else found them. Vaughn sighed. "Then we have to assume they're compromised." "No," she said softly, "not yet." He frowned. "You trust them that much?" "I trust the kind of guilt that keeps a man awake." She stood, walking to the window. "They'll make it back. I just don't know what will follow them when they do." Outside, storm clouds gathered, rare in the Arizona desert. Back in Somalia, Reed and Cameron reached the edge of the city before dawn. They hid the truck in an alley and took shelter inside an abandoned warehouse. Cameron slumped against the wall, breathing hard. "We can't stay here long. They'll lock down every road by sunrise." Reed opened the box again, laying out the contents. Photos of soldiers unloading crates, faces blurred by motion. Typed memos with missing signatures. One photograph showed a younger Colonel Vaughn shaking hands with a man whose face was circled in red ink. Cameron pointed. "Who's that?" Reed stared. "Looks like the DIA agent." Cameron froze. "The same one from Copper Ridge." Reed nodded slowly. She was right. They've been protecting him all along. He pulled a flash drive from the bottom of the box, labeled with 3 letters, HPS. "What's that mean?" Cameron asked. "I don't know," Reed said. "But if it's on this drive, it's what they've been trying to destroy." He slid it into his laptop. The screen flickered, then filled with documents, financial records, transfer logs, emails. Dates stretching from 1993 to 2023. Cameron whispered, "They never stopped." Reed scrolled through pages of data, each line more damning than the last. "These aren't just weapons. They've been selling intel, satellite data, classified tech, a 30-year shadow operation under the same cover." Cameron stared at him. "You think Irene knows?" "She suspected," Reed said, "but she didn't have proof." Now they did. But before Reed could save the files, his laptop pinged, a remote trace detected. "Damn it," he muttered, "they've found us." Cameron grabbed the gear. "Move." They bolted through the back door as headlights appeared at the far end of the street. Shots followed, splintering brick, shattering glass. Reed ducked behind a car, clutching the drive. "Go, I'll cover you." Cameron turned. "Not a chance." "Don't argue." "Not again," Cameron snapped. "You said some debts don't expire, neither does loyalty." They fired together, retreating toward the main road until the sound of sirens echoed through the chaos. Local police, or what was left of them, arrived, scattering the attackers. Reed and Cameron ducked into the crowd, blending with the confusion. The drive was still in Reed's hand, slick with sweat and dust. He exhaled shakily. She was right, everything she said. Cameron looked at him. "So what now?" Reed glanced toward the rising sun, blood drying on his sleeve. "Now we go home." At Copper Ridge, Irene stood at the memorial wall again. Her hands rested against the names Maria, Rebecca, as if grounding herself to the only truth she'd ever trusted. Vaughn entered holding a message slip. "Transmission from Reed," he said. "They're alive." Her eyes closed briefly. "And the proof?" He hesitated. "He says it's worse than we thought." She nodded slowly. "It always is." Outside, thunder rolled over the desert, soft, distant, inevitable. She turned toward Vaughn. "Then it begins." "What begins?" "The reckoning." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because some wars don't start with bullets. They start with the truth refusing to stay buried. And Irene Caldwell, the woman they once ignored, had just unearthed the one they'd spent 3 decades trying to silence. What happens when the truth finally comes home? It doesn't knock, it breaks the door down. By the time Reed's plane touched U.S. soil, the world had already changed. News channels were running 24-hour loops of speculation. Leaked documents suggest decades-old U.S. scandal in Somalia. But the anchors didn't know the half of it. Only 3 people on that plane did, and 2 of them were still bleeding from wounds that hadn't fully scabbed over. Cameron leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed, a bandage around his shoulder. "You think she's watching the news right now?" Reed stared out the window. "No, she doesn't need to." Because Irene Caldwell didn't wait for headlines. She felt shifts in the air, the way soldiers feel an ambush before it happens. At Copper Ridge, that instinct was already screaming. The Veterans Center looked the same, quiet, calm, harmless, but the silence carried weight now. Unmarked cars idled across the road. Journalists hovered behind the fence. A drone buzzed faintly above, pretending to film scenery. Inside, Irene stood by the coffee machine, watching the drip fall slow and steady into a chipped cup. Colonel Vaughn sat at the table across from her, scanning an official-looking memo with furrowed brows. "They're calling it a disinformation breach," he said. "Claims of foreign interference. They've already flagged your name as part of a psychological ops leak." Irene didn't blink. "So now I'm an enemy of my own country." "Not officially, yet." Vaughn lowered his voice. "But they've deployed a team from internal affairs. They're not coming to ask questions, they're coming to build a story." She smiled faintly. "Stories are all they've ever been good at." He hesitated. "You still trust Cole?" "I used to." Vaughn folded the memo uneasy. "He's been quiet since last night, too quiet." As if summoned, the door opened and Major Cole stepped in clean uniform, dark circles under his eyes. He gave a tight nod. "Colonel, Mrs. Caldwell." Vaughn stood. "You're just in time. Maybe you can explain why Command wants to place her under supervision." Cole didn't answer immediately. He set his phone on the table. "Because the president just saw the documents." Irene looked up slowly. "All of them." "Enough." "And—" Cole sighed. "Half the administration wants to bury it. The other half wants to make you a scapegoat." Vaughn's jaw clenched. "Of course they do." Cole looked tired, like a man caught between loyalty and conscience. "They're spinning it already. Headlines will say the files are fabrications, that you're part of an extremist leak designed to undermine public confidence in national institutions." "Translation," Irene said quietly. "They'll destroy my credibility before the truth even lands." Cole nodded. "They've done it before." "Then let them," she said. "If they have to lie that loud, it means they're afraid." But even as she spoke, the weight of it pressed into her bones. 32 years of silence had cost her everything, and now, telling the truth was costing the rest. That evening, the veterans gathered in the lounge, the same men who'd once mocked the cleaning lady for her badge. Now they watched her like she was the last line of defense they had left. Leonard Shaw sat beside her. "You know, I spent 50 years trying to forget the faces of the men I couldn't save. You ever wonder if forgetting is mercy?" Irene smiled gently. "No, forgetting is surrender. Mercy is remembering and choosing to keep living anyway." He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. Then maybe we're both still fighting. At the same hour, Reed and Cameron stepped off a cargo plane at Fort Ironwood under false names. The flash drive never left Reed's hand. They were met by a single vehicle, black, unmarked. Colonel Vaughn had arranged it. The driver gave no names, only coordinates, Copper Ridge. As the van sped through the desert, Cameron watched the sun bleeding over the horizon. Feels like coming back from a war no one remembers. Reed's voice was low. Maybe that's the only kind that matters. He checked his phone. No signal, no updates, just static. The kind that hums right before something goes wrong. At Copper Ridge, things were going wrong. Major Cole was still in the conference room with Vaughn, but his tone had shifted, sharper now, rehearsed. They've authorized a containment order, he said. Media lockdown. She'll be transferred to a secure facility for her own protection. Vaughn's eyes narrowed. Protection from who? Cole met his gaze evenly. From herself, from people who might exploit her. Or from the truth she carries. Cole exhaled. You don't understand how far this goes, Colonel. The DIA, the contractors, the politicians, they'll burn everything before they let this hit daylight. And you're helping them. I'm trying to keep it from turning into something worse. Irene stepped into the doorway. There's nothing worse than silence, Major. You just haven't lived with it long enough to know. Cole turned to her, his face a mask of regret. You don't get it. They've already made up their minds. You've been declared unstable, PTSD, trauma delusions. It's all in your file now. Who wrote it? She asked softly. I did. The room froze. Vaughn took a step forward, fury rising. You son of. Don't, Irene said quietly. She looked at Cole, calm, unreadable. You're just doing what they trained you to do, follow orders and call it duty. Cole's voice broke slightly. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice, she said. The question is whether you can live with it. He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. Outside, a convoy approached, black SUVs kicking up plumes of desert dust. Vaughn looked out the window. They're here. Cole's radio crackled. Team Alpha in position. He didn't respond. Instead, Irene walked to the table, picked up her badge and pinned it back on. Then let them come, she said. Vaughn looked at her. We can still move you out the back. No, running makes me guilty. Standing makes me free. The SUV stopped at the gate. Men in tactical gear poured out, moving in precise formation. It wasn't law enforcement, it was something else. Quiet, efficient, authorized by no one visible. Inside, Vaughn and Shaw took positions by the windows. Cameron and Reed weren't there yet, still an hour away. Irene stood in the center of the room, eyes closed, whispering something under her breath, not prayer exactly, more like memory. The door burst open. A lead agent stepped in, rifle lowered but ready. Mrs. Caldwell, you're under protective custody pending further investigation. She didn't move. Protective custody or containment. He hesitated. Ma'am, please cooperate. Vaughn's hand went to his holster. You take one more step, you answer to me. The agent froze, torn between protocol and instinct. Cole stepped forward, voice calm but urgent. Everyone stand down. No one wants this to turn violent. Too late, Irene said softly. It already did 32 years ago. For a long moment, no one moved. Then from outside, the low growl of an approaching engine, a van tearing up the dirt road. Reed. The agents turned instinctively toward the sound. Vaughn took the opening. He stepped forward, snatched Cole's radio and barked, "Stand down now." Confusion rippled through the formation. Orders clashed over comms. The van skidded to a stop, door flying open. Reed jumped out, holding the flash drive high. We have proof, he shouted. The agents froze. Cameras from the fence caught everything. Reporters who'd been waiting all day now had their moment. Cole's face went pale. Oh, God. Reed marched forward, Cameron behind him. Every name, every dollar, every lie, it's all here. You can bury one person, maybe two, but you can't bury 30 years of receipts. Vaughn stepped beside him, broadcasted. Cole grabbed his arm. You don't know what that'll do. Entire programs, alliances gone overnight. People will die. Reed looked at Irene. Your call. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she whispered, let the light fall where it must. Reed plugged the drive into a laptop connected to a portable transmitter. Within seconds, data flooded the screen and out to the open web. Dozens of journalists watching from the gate caught the signal live. Cole's radio exploded with voices. Containment compromised. Repeat. But it was over. The information was out. The agents lowered their weapons. Some stepped back, realizing they weren't cleaning up a secret anymore. They were standing inside history. Irene exhaled slowly, as if releasing 3 decades of air she'd been holding. Vaughn looked at her, voice breaking. You did it. No, she said. We did what should have been done the day we came home. Outside, reporters shouted. The sun broke through a crack in the storm clouds, light spilling across the desert. But not all shadows vanish in daylight. As Reed turned to shut down the laptop, a single gunshot cracked the air. Everyone froze. Cole stood motionless, pistol in hand, eyes wide with disbelief. He hadn't meant to, or maybe he had. Irene stumbled, her hand clutching her chest. Vaughn caught her before she fell. No, 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 stay with me, he pleaded. Her lips curved faintly, blood tracing down her chin. Don't be sad, Colonel. Some battles aren't meant to be survived. Her eyes found Reed. You keep it clean, soldier. Don't let them rewrite it again. Then her hand slipped from his grasp. The room went still. Outside, the cameras were still rolling. Vaughn closed her eyes gently. Sometimes, he whispered, dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. An hour later, the sun was high. The world already knew her name. Across news networks, her photo filled the screens, the same badge glinting in the morning light. Headlines split the nation, hero or traitor, the truth about Major Irene Caldwell. But those who'd been there, Vaughn, Reed, Cameron, didn't need headlines. They knew. They stood by the memorial wall as medics carried her body away. Vaughn placed the badge beside Maria's and Rebecca's names. Now there were 3. Reed stared at it, voice hoarse. She said truth was heavier than bullets. Cameron nodded. She forgot to mention it ricochets longer too. Night fell over Copper Ridge. The lights of news vans faded one by one. Vaughn sat alone at the window, the world outside silent again. But it wasn't the same silence anymore. It was the kind that follows justice, painful, imperfect, but finally earned. Because wars end when people stop shooting. But truth ends when people stop listening. And that night, somewhere between the last echo of the gunshot and the first whisper of forgiveness, the world finally began to listen. The first morning after a storm never looks like victory. It looks like silence trying to remember what to do next. At Copper Ridge, the flags hung at half-mast, not because the order came from above, but because the old soldiers inside the center had raised them that way themselves. No speeches, no cameras, just weathered hands tying knots the way they once tied tourniquets. The badge rested beneath glass now. 3 names. 3 women. 1 truth. Colonel Vaughn stood by the window, coffee untouched. Outside, reporters still crowded the gates, their questions echoing through the desert air. Who was she really? Was she right? Who's to blame? He didn't answer. None of them did. Sometimes silence is the only form of respect left. Across the country, the story had detonated. Cable news ran it like a fever. The Caldwell files. Hashtags trended. Protesters marched in front of federal buildings holding photos of Irene in uniform. Half the nation called her a hero. The other half called her a traitor. Washington was in triage. Committees formed overnight. Hearings were scheduled, canceled, rescheduled again. One network leaked part of the flash drive data, proof of off-the-books arms deals, signed under names no longer alive to answer. And somewhere inside the Pentagon, someone whispered what everyone feared. She wasn't lying. Reed watched the chaos unfold from a motel room outside Phoenix. The TV light flickered across his face. Images of Irene, of Vaughn at the gate, of himself clutching the drive. Every news anchor spoke his name now, the lieutenant who broke the silence. Cameron sat on the bed beside him, cleaning his weapon out of habit, not need. "You should be proud," he said. Reed didn't look away from the screen. "Proud doesn't bring her back." Cameron nodded. "No, but it keeps her from dying for nothing." The knock at the door startled them both. Vaughn stepped in, dressed in plain clothes this time. He looked smaller somehow, but steadier. "It's done," he said. "Congress opened an inquiry. They're calling it the Caldwell Commission." Reed almost laughed. "They're nomming a committee after the woman they tried to erase." "That's the thing about ghosts," Vaughn said. "They don't disappear, they haunt until you listen." He handed Reed an envelope. "Your testimony. You'll be called within a week." Reed frowned. "And you?" "Already gave mine." Vaughn's eyes softened. "They asked if I regretted standing beside her." "What you tell them?" "That regret, for men who stood on the other side." Back at Copper Ridge, life didn't return to normal, it found something else instead. The veterans turned the common room into a memorial. Photos of forgotten soldiers lined the walls. Letters from families who'd watched the hearings poured in from across the country. Ruth Peterson read them aloud during breakfast. "My mother served in Desert Storm," she read. "She never talked about it. After seeing Irene on TV, she finally told us her story." Leonard Shaw wiped his eyes. "She lit a fuse, didn't she?" Ernesto Garcia smiled through tears. "Maybe not a fuse, maybe a candle." Outside, people began leaving flowers at the gate. Strangers, children, young soldiers who'd never met her but somehow felt like they had. Meanwhile, Major Cole faced his own reckoning. He sat in a small interrogation room, wrists free but reputation shackled. Across from him, two investigators from the Inspector General's office laid out photos, documents, transfers, signatures. "You falsified a psychological report," one said. "You enabled an unauthorized raid." Cole stared at the table. "I tried to keep control." "You failed." He looked up then, eyes hollow. "No, I obeyed." The younger investigator leaned forward. "Why pull the trigger, Major?" Cole's voice was barely a whisper. "Because someone had to stop the truth before it stopped us." The older investigator studied him quietly. "Did it work?" Cole gave a broken laugh. "You're sitting here, aren't you, asking questions you weren't supposed to ask. No, gentlemen, it didn't work." Weeks passed. The hearings became theater. Generals in pressed uniforms sat under fluorescent lights and spoke of oversight failures and historical context. Senators wagged fingers for cameras. But somewhere beneath the noise, a quieter story was taking root. Veterans speaking out about their own forgotten missions, their own buried truths. Reed sat through every hearing, jaw clenched, listening. When his turn came, he didn't read from notes. He told them about Irene not as a myth, but as a woman. "She wasn't trying to destroy this country," he said into the microphone. "She was trying to remind it what integrity looks like when no one's watching." The room went silent. For the first time, even the cameras seemed to stop breathing. Afterward, outside the Capitol steps, a reporter asked him, "Lieutenant, do you think she was a hero?" Reed paused. "No," he said finally. "I think she was a soldier, and that should have been enough." The clip went viral in hours. Far away, in a quiet corner of the desert, Colonel Vaughn visited her grave. No ceremony, no marble, just a small bronze plaque that read, Maj. Irene Caldwell, 118th MP Company. Duty known only to God. He placed 3 brass casings on the dirt, one for each woman who never got to finish her mission. The wind picked up, stirring dust around his boots. He looked toward the horizon where the sun bled into the sand. "You won, Irene," he said softly, "even if they never say it." Then he added, quieter still, "And you took my excuses with you." Cameron stayed behind at Copper Ridge. He started recording veterans' testimonies, old men, forgotten women, anyone willing to speak. He called it the Silent House Project. Every story began with the same question: where were you when the silence started? People listened. For the first time in decades, they listened. And sometimes, late at night, when the center went quiet, Cameron swore he could still hear Irene's voice echoing through the halls, not words exactly, just presence. The kind that stays when purpose hasn't finished its work. Reed didn't return to the army. He couldn't. But he didn't leave the fight either. He testified before international panels, wrote quietly under pseudonyms, helped draft reforms that would take years to pass. Every time someone tried to co-opt her name for politics, he pushed back. "She belongs to no side," he'd say. "She belongs to the truth." One night, as he left yet another interview, he found an envelope under his car wiper. No return address. Inside, a single photo, Irene at Copper Ridge, smiling faintly at something off camera. On the back, in Vaughn's handwriting, she was right. The truth doesn't die, it redeploys. Reed stood there a long time, the city lights flickering against the windshield, thinking how strange it was that one quiet woman could make an entire world remember its conscience. Months later, Congress passed the Caldwell Transparency Act. Small step, symbolic maybe, but every change starts as a whisper. And in that whisper was her name. At the dedication ceremony, Vaughn stood with Cameron, Ruth, Leonard, Ernesto, and dozens of others who'd gathered at the center. The new memorial wall gleamed in the Arizona sun. A plaque read, "For those who served in silence, whose courage outlasted permission, and whose truth refused to die." Reed spoke briefly. "She once told me some wars never end," he said. "She was right, but maybe now this one can rest." The crowd stood in silence. No anthem, no salutes, just wind moving through the flagpoles, carrying the faintest metallic chime from the old badge sealed beneath the glass. That night, Copper Ridge glowed softly under the desert moon. Inside, the veterans gathered around a small radio tuned to a news broadcast. The anchor's voice was calm now, reverent even. "Major Caldwell's disclosure has prompted sweeping reform across multiple agencies." Ruth turned down the volume, think she'd believe it if she saw it. Vaughn smiled faintly. She'd probably say they're still missing the point. Leonard chuckled, "And what point that?" "That honor isn't what you wear," Vaughn said. "It's what you carry when no one's watching." The room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not fear, not shame. Peace. Outside, the desert wind moved softly through the memorial garden, stirring dust and flowers alike. And somewhere in memory, in story, in the voices of those she'd awakened, Irene Caldwell lived on. Because truth doesn't fade. It multiplies. It finds new carriers, new uniforms, new hands brave enough to hold it. And in that way, she was never really gone. They say every war ends twice. Once on the battlefield, and once in the heart of the last person who remembers it. For Irene Caldwell, both wars had ended. But her echo was just beginning. 6 months after the hearings, the desert bloomed. It didn't happen often, maybe once every few years, when the rains came just right and the cracked soil decided to forgive the sky. Wildflowers spread across Copper Ridge like a quiet apology from the earth itself. The veterans called it her season. Colonel Vaughn still came every morning. Same black coffee, same seat by the window, same habit of staring at the horizon as if expecting someone to walk out of it. Sometimes Ruth would join him. She'd place a small bouquet by the badge display before sitting down. You ever wonder if she knew it would end this way? Vaughn smiled faintly. She didn't plan endings, she planned exits. Ruth chuckled softly. There's a difference. Yeah, he said. One's surrender, the other's grace. The world had moved on, as it always does. New scandals replaced old ones. New wars replaced old ghosts. But somewhere under all the noise, the Caldwell story had carved a permanent groove. Military reform committees cited her name in policy changes. Training programs quoted her final words in their ethics modules. Cadets at West Point read excerpts from the Silent House report, Cameron's compilation of veterans' testimonies that had become a bestseller. But none of that was what she would have cared about. Not the recognition, not the awards. She would have cared about the quieter victories, the kind that don't make news. A widow in Kentucky, finally receiving her husband's long-denied commendation. A whistleblower in D.C. deciding not to delete a file. A young cadet refusing to falsify a report because a cleaning lady once taught him what honor really meant. That was her legacy, the invisible kind. The kind that doesn't need monuments. One evening, as the sun sank low, Reed returned to Copper Ridge for the first time since the hearings. He parked outside the gate, engine off, watching the flag sway in the wind. Cameron met him halfway down the path, still limping slightly. "You look like you've aged 10 years, he said. Reed smirked. "Feels like 30. They walked through the memorial garden. Fresh flowers lined the stones. Each name shimmered faintly in the dying light. When they reached hers, Reed knelt. He didn't speak at first. There were no words heavy enough for gratitude and guilt at the same time. Finally, he whispered, "I never apologized." Cameron folded his arms. She didn't want an apology. She wanted someone to finish the job. Reed nodded. "And did we?" "Depends what you think the job was." Reed looked up. "The truth." Cameron smiled faintly. "Then yeah, we finished it, and it's still working." They stood there a long while, the wind moving softly through the desert grass. When they turned to leave, Reed noticed something etched into the bottom corner of the plaque. It hadn't been there before. 5 small words, barely visible in the brass. "Silence is never neutral." He traced it with his thumb. "That's her handwriting." Cameron nodded. Vaughn found it in her journal, thought it belonged here. Later that night, Vaughn joined them in the common room. The old radio played low jazz through static. They sat together, 3 soldiers bound not by rank or mission, but by memory. Cameron broke the silence. "You ever think she knew how much she'd change?" Vaughn stared into his coffee. "No, I think she just couldn't stand not changing anything." Reed leaned back, voice low. "She used to say dignity doesn't speak, it acts." "Yeah," Vaughn said, "and when it acts, it doesn't ask permission." The room went quiet again, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was peace wearing armor. Outside, lightning flickered over the horizon. Rain followed, soft and steady, tapping against the glass like a heartbeat. By morning, the desert smelled alive again. News broke that a new medal would be created, the Caldwell Citation for Integrity and Service. A symbolic gesture, maybe, but one that meant something to those who still believed the uniform should stand for truth before politics. At the ceremony, a young woman in a crisp Air Force uniform stepped to the podium. She was no one famous, just a junior pilot, but her voice didn't tremble when she spoke. "My mother told me stories about Irene Caldwell," she said. "Not the kind you see in textbooks, the kind you feel in your bones. about standing when standing hurts, about doing the right thing when you're the last one left to do it. She taught me that silence isn't loyalty, it's fear wearing medals. The crowd fell silent. Vaughn, seated in the front row, felt something crack open in his chest, pride and grief folded into one. When the pilot stepped down, she paused by him, saluted sharply, and whispered, "She made me want to serve." Vaughn managed a small nod. Then she's still serving. That evening, he returned alone to the memorial garden. The sun dipped low, painting the stones in gold. He placed his cap on the bench beside her plaque. "We did what we could, Irene. I hope that's enough." A breeze stirred. A petal from a desert lily brushed against the brass. Vaughn smiled. "I'll take that as a yes." Far away in Washington, the Caldwell Commission released its final report. Its findings shook the foundations but stopped short of names. The system, as always, protected itself. But buried deep in the appendix was a paragraph written by Reed, anonymous, unsigned but unmistakably his. History will debate whether she was right or reckless. But history wasn't there the morning she chose to stand instead of kneel. The rest of us were, and that's enough. It was the last line that mattered most. The measure of a soldier isn't obedience. It's conscience under fire. Years passed. Copper Ridge grew quieter again. Fewer reporters, more wildflowers. Cameron ran the Silent House project full-time now. Vaughn still came on anniversaries. And Reed, he never wore the uniform again, but he carried it differently now. Not as fabric, as responsibility. Every few months, he'd visit schools, talk to new recruits, and end with the same story. The one that began with laughter in a cafeteria and ended with a nation forced to remember its reflection. He never said her name until the very end. And every time he did, the room went still. Because her name had become something sacred, not in religion but in honesty. One night, long after the center had gone dark, a storm rolled over the desert. Wind howled against the windows, thunder cracked across the sky. And in the brief flash of lightning, Vaughn swore he saw her. Standing by the garden head high, uniform sharp, badge gleaming. Not haunting, guarding. He blinked and she was gone. But the feeling stayed, the strange, steady calm that soldiers feel when they know the watch isn't over, just handed off. Morning broke clear and blue. Reed arrived quietly, parking beside the fence. He walked through the garden, the smell of wet sand heavy in the air. He stopped by her plaque, touched the badge sealed beneath the glass, and whispered, "Mission complete." Then he looked up at the sky, that same endless Arizona blue she used to love, and smiled. "Rest easy, Major, we've got the watch." The camera would linger there, over the memorial, the wind, the sunlight flaring on the brass. And the voiceover, soft, deliberate, final, would speak the truth she lived for. In every generation, there's someone who refuses to stay quiet. Not because they crave noise, but because silence has weight. And they've carried it long enough. Irene Caldwell wasn't a legend. She was proof. Proof that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to lie. And maybe that's how wars really end. Not with peace treaties or medals, but when one quiet soul finally stands up and reminds the world what it forgot. That honor isn't what you're given. It's what you never surrender. The camera would fade to black. The music, slow, orchestral, heavy with strings, would rise, then fall into silence. And in that silence, you'd hear it, the echo of her badge striking the table one last time. Not as a sound of ending, but as the start of something that doesn't die. Because some truths don't need voices. They just need someone brave enough to carry them.